Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, and we are very fortunate to welcome back a good friend of the Gaggle, Hans Mahncke, and he's a kind of expert on many, many things, an absolutely indefatigable researcher. And his daily podcast with Jeff Carlson, who has also been a guest on the Gaggle, is absolutely not to be missed. Viewing, tune in every day. They always have some interesting insights. So, but today, Hans, we kind of want to get up to speed on what's going on with the Trump administration and the innumerable, vast litigation apparat that has been unleashed against it. There's something like 220 lawsuits and counting, and that's just the first 100 days. And then today, Donald Trump announced that he's rescinding the tax exempt status of Harvard. And then yesterday we had a Texas district court judge, a Trump appointee, incidentally, who ruled against the Trump administration's use of the Alien Enemies Act, said this is an illegal way of going about things. And then we've got so many different things. We've got lawsuits involving immigration, which has obviously received the most attention. But there's also other things like DOGE, people who are getting fired, money that's the government is withholding from programs. We've got issues with DEI, transgender rights, even now tariffs. So just first of all, let's take, if you can give us an overview of what's happening, and then where it's likely to lead, and what you think is the appropriate remedy, because in some ways it's a possibility that we may be heading towards a constitutional crisis. So
And Hans, and all of that, what George has had to say, and if you can address the free speech issue as well, because that's also very much in play here.
That's exactly right. Let me start with something that I haven't seen much commentary on, which is all of this is, of course, in the context of the first 100 days. And wasn't it the old sort of norm that the first 100 days you leave the new president alone so that it's kind of a honeymoon period so that they can start implementing their agenda and then you start attacking them and then you start doing all those things? I mean, at least that's how I remember it from the old days. And funnily enough, the only person who abided by that was Kamala Harris because she kept quiet for 100 days and she came out on the 100th day to do her speech. So, um,
It's so good, yeah.
it's just absolutely fascinating, and again, it's sort of a sign of the media rot that we have these days. That no one really talks about that part of it. Everyone talks about the 100 days in terms of all these horrible things that Trump has done, or all the things that are being done to push back, but no one talks about the fact why we even have this 100-day thing. So I thought that was probably a kind of that's the context which I see it in. And of course, it is not unprecedented because Trump's first term was defined by the same thing. And his first 100 days were also completely ruined against the norms. But as you say, they were ruined in a very different way. They had this Russiagate hoax, and everything was about that. He was a Russian agent, and every day, there would be 4 or 5 news stories tying him with Russia, all of them fake. So this time around, they've gone via the judiciary. They're going the judicial route. So Democrats are in a bit of disarray. So, as George said, they have all these judges coming down with all kinds of injunctions against pretty much anything he does. I mean, you can pick it. It's just immigration, it's firing people, it's DEI. I mean, anything whatsoever that he does, defunding US aid, whatever it is, they're going to find a judge somewhere who's going to rule against him. And as you said, the shocking but not necessarily surprising thing is that it's not just Obama and Biden judges. You also have Trump judges doing this. So the judiciary is out of control. The numbers are incredible. I mean, when you look at the overall numbers of injunctions against Biden, it maybe got a few dozen or so, and now we're in the hundreds within 100 days. And um, where is this heading? What is going to happen, and so on? I mean, first of all these cases feed through the system and ultimately they end up with the Supreme Court. So the question is, what's the Supreme Court going to do about it? My guess is that it's going to be a mixed bag. In some of these cases, they're going to say, no, Trump can go ahead with this and that. And in other cases, they're going to say he cannot go ahead. So you come out sort of none the wiser in many ways, and certainly none the wiser in terms of overarching strategy, in terms of overarching predictability, because if you're the executive, you need to know that what you're going to do is going to work. You need to be able to plan ahead, and having this kind of the judiciary kind of tied around your neck here is just very, very destructive. I'm sure they anticipated some of this,
Sure.
probably not to the extent that it's happened. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously I don't know what's going to happen, but my prediction is that it's going to be a mixed bag in terms of where these things end up. But
Well,
unfortunately,
where, I suppose, George and I have kind of skirted this because there've been so many other things in the news that we've talked about. But where is the judicial abuse? Okay, is it coming from the executive branch, or is we have the politicization of the judiciary? I mean, because the more I delve into this, I mean, I think we could all come up with pristine cases proving abuse on this side, abuse on that side. There's so many of them right now. But, when we look at the free speech issue and then deporting people to El Salvador, I don't want to get into was he part of this gang or not? I'm not, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but due process is something that I'm really
Right, but
worried.
that's what I want
And
to
let
ask.
me
All right.
hang on, George. Okay, it's you know I don't want to see abuse of the judiciary by the executive, and I don't like political judges. Okay, but I mean, I think we can. I think we need to kind of hammer down a little bit more specifically on that because we if there is abuse in like I think all sides are involved in that here. Where do we come? I mean, are we making the judiciary irrelevant? Are we looking at a super executive power
Right, right.
unchecked? I
Okay,
mean,
but okay,
okay,
but you mentioned this, the due process, and that's a very important issue because that's really what we're arguing about. Is, well, for instance, when you have gang members, members who have been designated as members of terrorist organizations, and people who are illegally in the country, and then say, well, they have due process rights. Is that true? And if they do have due process rights, how far do they go? I mean, do they say have the same due process rights as
good
American
question.
citizens? Do they have the same due process rights as permanent residents in the United States? What does that mean? Oh, they have due process rights.
well, that's a very good question, and it depends on the circumstances. So, everyone knows who's ever crossed a border, the United States or any other country, is that they can just say no, you can't come in, and you do not have a right of appeal or anything, and they can put you on the next plane home. So then there's a kind of a graduation. What if you're already in? Can they then send you home? Well, yeah, they can. What if you have a green card? Then you guys kind of get into a little bit sort of more, complex territory in terms of how that's going to work out. So, and those things are working their way through the courts, and the courts will eventually decide, this guy has some more rights, this guy has some less rights, and so on. And here I'm just talking about what Peter said, the free speech and people having their visas revoked and so on and so forth. With these MS-13, some people might say it was a mistake to invoke this Aliens Act because it is a very old act and they kind of repurposed it. And I could see what they were trying to do. They were trying to think outside the box and so on. But you're going to find most judges, just for the fun of it, say, "Whoa, oh, my job is to do legal interpretation and sort of statutory interpretation and so on. And I'm not sure that this law from hundreds of years ago should apply here because of this or that." And then they just kind of get into their legal stuff. And that's why you even have, as you mentioned, Trump judges doing this kind of stuff. So at that point, it might not even be political. It's just like, well, I'm a lawyer at heart, so I have to, analyze all this. So maybe they should have chosen some other path of getting rid of these people. In terms of, I mean, there's just, it's such a broad spectrum of things that have happened. So it's difficult to, talk in generalities. I mean, let's talk about
Yeah,
this.
that's the point. That's exactly it. Talking about it in generalities. That's what terrifies me here, because again, the due process here. It's not. I mean, if you know more obviously about the law than I do, but it's not just citizens. It's persons. It's persons have the right to due process here, and I'm the first to agree. George and I have talked about this before. I knew something like this was going to. It was inevitable that something like this was going to happen, and particularly after the disastrous 4 years of Biden with an open border. No one should be surprised this is happening. But when the when we talk about, it's difficult to generalize, there seems to be those that want to take advantage of that. See, I would err on the side of caution. Others going to say, oh, no, and there's more ambiguity here that we can take advantage of. And what about citizens themselves? I mean, when Trump was in the Oval Office with the El Salvadorian president, I mean, he was hot mic, and, we want to get rid of I'm paraphrasing, of course, our criminals and all of that. I mean, I know it's Trump and there's always hyperbole involved with this guy, but I mean, he is the chief executive. I mean, once you start doing something like this, you're setting a precedent for more generalizations and ambiguities. And I think that's I'm very worried about that. I don't, gang members and people that got here illegally and people that are involved in crime, absolutely get them out, okay? But that's not everybody,
Well,
okay?
we're talking about say 20 million people who are illegally in the country. Now, if you're going to give due process rights to 20 million people, then that's going to take about 1 million years to
Well, George, there's a
resolve.
difference between a trial and a hearing. Hearings can last 3 to 5 minutes,
Right,
okay?
but the hearing should be pretty straightforward. I mean, if you're here illegally, then you're illegal, you're gone. There's no there's
Yeah,
no
but,
there's
but,
no
uh,
there's
but
no reason.
Hans has made it clear it's not that clear
Well, it is
cut.
clear. I mean, let's say this guy Diego Abrego, he was judged eligible for deportation in 2019. Why is he still in the country in 2025? I mean, that's an example of, or his due process rights. He's still in the country, and that's just one person, and then he's got a lot of attention. So that's why if you're talking about deportations, the people who are illegally in the country really have very, very limited rights. I mean, if you can't prove that you're in the country legally, you haven't made an asylum application, you're in the country legally, then you're gone. I mean, why waste everybody's time and money to go through these due process rights? But anyway, Hans, I mean, what do you think?
I mean, you're absolutely right. You let 20 million in without any due process, without any process, without anything. But now you insist on everyone having their day in court in order to kick them out again. Um, I suspect that's not going to hold. So once the Supreme Court deals, I mean, these issues get to the Supreme Court on the back of individual cases of people whom the ACLU or whoever represents it, and then it go up, and then they generalize it. Say, okay, if you fall into this category, you have to go, or the government can just decide to get rid of you, which is where I think this is going to end up with people just came in illegally and that's it. The problem, as George, you just said, is what if they claim asylum, as the Abrado, the Kilmar guy did? Then you're going to have to come up with a different kind of set of rules pertaining to those people, because if you claim asylum, then under all kinds of rules and norms, you are entitled to some kind of hearing. The problem is that a lot of them did not claim asylum, and they've been around for 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. The Kilmar guy was around, I think, for 7 years. Then they rounded him up, and then he claimed asylum all of a sudden, kind of after having been around for all these years. So on those issues, that we're going to have to see what the Supreme Court says in terms of whether that person is entitled to any kind of due process before they get kicked out. Because, I mean, I guess just from I don't know what they're going to decide with the Supreme Court nowadays. It's just such a mess. They just kind of, they're all over the place. There's no consistency at all. But my guess, just based on common sense and just general legal norms and so on, is that anyone who didn't claim asylum immediately when they entered illegally is going to fall into that category of person who can just be deported, no due process, no anything. So But we're just going to have to sort through the process. As I said, everyone kind of falls into a different bucket and then different rules may apply. So we're going to have to see what happens with illegals in that sense. So that's my guess as to what's going to happen. In terms of the people who entered legally, again, have very different buckets. Is it just a tourist? Is it a person on a student visa? Has the person already got a green card? I mean, there's probably a couple of categories in between. So you're probably going to end up with 10 different buckets. And then for each of those buckets, they're going to come up with a separate rule. Now, the sad thing, of course, is that this hasn't been done yet, or in some cases it has been done, but it's just not being applied properly. But we're just going to have to go through the motions again, because with all these cases, that's the only way that this is gonna work out. So at the end of the day, we're going to find out, and so again, Supreme Court is where all this ends up, and they're going to come up with rules where, depending on what bucket you're in, that's what's going to happen to you, this and that, whatever. So some get it, some don't get it in terms of the due process. And yeah, I think that's it. And I think the result, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be mixed. There's not going to be one rule for all.
I'm going to scratch your memory, George. I mean, I remember when Trump was president, and I remember you and I over and over again. It's very clear under the law that the chief executive determines immigration law. They have a lot of latitude right there. Okay, a lot of latitude, and I don't have a problem with that. Okay, I worry about abuse, but I don't have a problem with that prerogative. But Hans, what happens if the Trump administration says, and I have someone like Stephen Miller haunting me in the back of my brain, because he's a wickedly devious, smart guy, okay? He's very, very good at what he does. What happens if the Trump administration says we don't agree? Because we're on that path with the
Yeah, I
Supreme
don't think
Court.
that's going to happen. I think ultimately, there may be some people who say, let's just ignore the courts. Ultimately, I don't think that's going to happen. And ultimately, I think that's because of President Trump himself. I think he himself would not want to be the president who does that. Now, what might happen, and by the way, this is what Biden did all the time, or Biden's people, because Biden really himself wasn't doing much, is you pretend to, follow whatever the court said, but then you don't kind of really do that. So that would be, if I was there, that's what I would advocate for. Just kind of stretch it a bit, interpret it a bit, and so on. Look at the border wall, for instance. So there was funding for the border wall. So under the rule that we've been told for the past few weeks is like, whoa, if Congress funds it, you have to spend it, you have to do it, right? That's what we keep being told about NPR and USAID and all this kind of stuff. So how come that didn't apply to the border wall? Because Biden played it smart. There were actually court cases on it, and the court said, well, you do. It was assigned, the money was assigned, you got to do it. So he said, well, we got to do an environmental review. We got to do a contract review. We got to do an audit. We got to do whatever. You just come up with all kinds of things. So you sort of obstruct the process, and hopefully, you run out the clock. So that's how I would do it. Now, it's easier to do with a border wall than it is with an individual that you've been told to not deport or to do whatever with. Again, I don't know what's going to happen, but I am very, very, very sure that they're going to follow the court's order, whatever it is, even if they don't.
But that's where,
or is it how they interpret the court's order?
right, but that's how
exactly.
it gets interesting, because we're talking about 20 million. And there's going to come a point, in a year's time, and they say, we just haven't got anybody out. I mean, this was a key promise by Trump that he will, enact mass deportation. He said, well, they're basically stuck in the courts. And then they're going to make the argument, and it's being made. This argument is being made by Steve Bannon, he's got Trump's ear, that essentially the courts do not have seniority over the other branches of government. It's not the top branch of government. Ultimately, this immigration, it falls within the realm of the executive, and the executive can simply ignore the court rulings, as other presidents have done in the past. Lincoln, and they bring up the example of Lincoln all the time. Lincoln's who suspended habeas corpus. We're talking about FDR, talking about Andrew Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant. Say other presidents have done it. We don't have to abide by court rulings. Now, why are you so sure that Trump isn't going to go down that path?
Because he doesn't want to be that president. He doesn't want to be remembered for that. he'll just forge on in hopefully the way I just described, where they try and kind of reinterpret and here and there and so on to get what they want. Um, but of course, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, well,
ultimately,
I think you could make the argument, I mean, make the opposite argument. Trump wants to be remembered as the guy that broke things and moved quickly. I think that's what his most hardcore base followers want.
but
Believe me,
remember
they're
when he
not
was.
interested in constitutional law. They're not. Okay. I
But
think that, you know,
I think it comes down to Trump himself that he will not do that. I mean, remember to give an example. Remember back when this horrific Marchand, this New York judge, put a gag order on him, which was completely unconstitutional. I mean, he's being completely trashed by the media about this phony case. Every day, the in the court is just lies and lies and lies, and he's not allowed to defend himself. He's not allowed to say anything because the judge gave him a gag order. Well, guess what? He abided by it. So that was kind of a good litmus test of where he's ultimately going to land on this. That
interesting.
doesn't mean he's not, they're just going to take it, whatever the court says, and just sort of take it as written or at face value. I think they will find other clever ways of doing this or that. Plus, I don't think all the court judgments in the end will be negative. As I said, I think it's going to be a mixed bag. I think, other than that, kind of thinking beyond the courts here, there has to be a strategy. There's some little indications that there is a strategy. I don't think it's well thought out enough yet, or at least not visible enough yet, of just self-deportation. That's ultimately going to be how you resolve this, because 20 million is a huge number. If 20 million, as George said, a few minutes ago, if 20 million get a court hearing, that's going to take hundreds of years. That's not going to happen. Some of them might, again, depending on what the Supreme Court comes down with and so on. But in the meantime, you're going to have to create other incentives and other kind of pressure and so on. Again, we have seen they had got this app out where you can self-deport via app. I'm not sure why you would do that. I mean, you just might as well just leave and not leave a paper trail or whatever. But there are other things they can do. I mean, there are things they can do with, say, driver's licenses, employment, and all that kind of stuff, where they just make these people's lives very, very difficult. Plus the pressure of, oh, maybe someone's going to come tomorrow morning and pick me up, and that's not a good feeling to have. And you can definitely increase the pressure on that a lot, and you can achieve, in my view, a lot more through that than any of these other means
And
or
we
any of these
also
other
have the
forms.
institution of
Mm.
snitching on people. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Hans, you said earlier that they're going to have different buckets. I think you're absolutely right. Let's talk about the bucket of freedom of speech. This graduate student, was she at, I'm not trying to remember where,
Tufts.
Tufts, okay, writing an editorial. And the Secretary of State has apparently the power to deem this person to be a threat to American national security. How do you balance security with freedom of speech in this bucket?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first question is, does a non-citizen enjoy the same constitutional rights as a citizen? And even that answer is not yes. I mean, it's more nuanced than that. Um, then as you say, the power of the Secretary of State is seemingly, absolute in terms of deciding over the status of non-citizens. Um, I think a third argument here, which again hasn't been made in the media at all, and I mean, I don't know enough about these individual cases to know exactly what's going on in these cases, but um, what the media often says, oh, but they haven't been convicted of any crime. Okay, but that's not the standard. At least not that's not the standard as it is right now. And the question is, could they have been charged with a crime? I mean, maybe it's not just free speech. Maybe it's other things. You kept hearing about these campus protests and so on, and people getting violent and people, all that kind of stuff. So, is there something where they just say, well, if it was an American citizen, we would go via that route, but since this is just a foreigner, we can just cancel their visa, so they just skip that route. Um, I don't know. There's just so much going on there. I mean, generally, look, I completely agree. free speech is free speech, and I would hate to do anything to anyone for free speech completely independent of what, their citizenship is or whatever. My suspicion is that there is more than simply free speech involved with these people. And by the way, it's not like there's 4 million students, foreign students in the US. Um, it's not like, the huge numbers are affected. I know people don't really like that argument because, well, even if it's just a few hundred, I know, but first of all, it's like it's pretty targeted. I think we just need to
Yeah.
know more
There's
about
also,
these.
sorry, there's also an aspect of it is whether people sympathize with this person's views or not. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for this person, what she wrote, and so does Peter. But supposing the person wasn't a pro-Palestinian author, suppose this was a Holocaust denier, a kind of somebody who was writing editorials rehabilitating Hitler, he'd be
Yeah.
gone. And no one would say a word, that and no one would say, "Hey, well, what about freedom of speech?" This person's entitled to rehabilitate Hitler if he wants. I mean, Glenn Greenwald might. I mean, he's a very principled person, but overwhelmingly the media say, "Well, good riddance." So, there really isn't that same free speech that people really adhere to. It's more a question of, do you like or have some sympathy with this person's view, then you make an issue out of it. If you don't like that view, then you don't make an issue out of it. So I just don't think, particularly in this case, she's a student, so she has limited rights to be here.
Well,
People, there are arguments, but at the same time, the government can decide you're gone, and that's.
well, that's kind of a sad state of affairs. But
But it's not
Hans,
sad. It's as I said, the
okay,
example.
well,
I
okay.
know, but I said the example is that yes, it's a sad state of affairs, but it can do it. It does it all the time. People are thrown out or not allowed to enter the country because in the past they'd been communist or fascist or racist or taken part in anything or other. They're just not allowed into the country. So, and
Well,
that's
Hans,
the government.
to go back
Look,
to your comment on this, is that this woman in question, if she had like broken a window or broken into an office, if that was the situation, we certainly would have heard about it, but we haven't heard about that. Okay, again, none of us know absolutely every single detail of this case. Okay, I've been following it pretty carefully, and even her detractors have never accused her of breaking some kind of ordinance that that any other citizen would be prosecuted for. So again, that's what makes it even more
It's not,
worrisome.
it's not prosecutable. I mean, whether you stay or go, it's not a question of whether you've committed a crime. That's
Well,
not
well,
the
well, well,
criteria.
George, take a look at what Marco Rubio said about this case. So,
I
and
don't agree with it.
he alluded, hang on, he alluded that she had broken laws. He didn't have any evidence that she did. Okay. That's why I bring up this question separately with Hans, is that, this is a very specific bucket when it comes to free speech. Okay. All these other issues, I'll give way on a lot of things. I won't give way on this one. Hans.
yeah, look, I'm very sympathetic to the free speech view. Um, and we will see how the buckets turn out. I mean, George is absolutely right. If you are just here on a visitor permit or whatever, they can just cancel it and you're gone. You don't have any rights. That's it. I I have a feeling they're going to come down a little bit more nuanced if it comes to legal permanent residence, maybe even longer term students on specific student type visas and so on. We're going to have to see the nuances there. So, of course, I generally have a problem with the idea that depending on what status you have, your rights to free speech kind of increase as you go along that spectrum. I don't like that. I think everyone should have free speech, and of course, aside from any broken windows, any other stuff, just the free speech part. That all said, I mean, we've all traveled around the world and so on, and I just think there's this kind of this unwritten rule, norm, whatever you want to call it, that if you're in some other country, you don't go and join these protests. You don't go and, make a ruckus and so on. And this is just me speaking. I'm not saying that should be the rule or that should be a law or that should be criminalized. I'm not talking about that at all. It's just a sort of if I'm in another country, I'll just be like lie low and I'm not going to join some protest or whatever. Now, some people might say, I'm too conservative in that, or I should whatever. That's just my view of things, and I guess the current administration see it the same way, that you're a guest here, you have to behave like a guest. And but again, that's a separate issue from the free speech to me. I mean, that sort of,
I
I,
agree. Agree.
I just there's a sort of a bit of a dichotomy within me, within like that's how I would behave. But I do also understand, and I completely agree that if it's just free speech, if you're just saying stuff, there should not be these kinds of consequences.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, that's why it's so troubling for me. George makes a very good argument. I'm not going to challenge him, and you also make good arguments. It just makes me viscerally uncomfortable on this specific issue of speech. That's it. Okay. I mean,
Well, it's also what George said which is such a good point, that if it's just troublemakers have to go, then I could perhaps even live with the free speech restriction again because of your guest and all that kind of stuff. But if within the troublemakers you have like favored ones and disfavored ones, then that's very, very problematic.
yeah, that's
Right. So now, we've done a couple of the immigration angle, but there are all sorts of other legal hurdles that have been placed in the way of the administration. For instance, the DOGE thing. Basically, here we have the president who fires people, and then the courts jump in and say, well, he doesn't have a right to fire people. Or the president decides that we're basically freezing grants that have been allocated, and the courts say, no, you don't have a right to freeze. And how are they going to be resolved?
Yeah, that's another really, really messy one. And there are so many cases again that it's very difficult to keep an overview. But every single department that DOGE has gone in and tried to clean up, you've had cases, and in almost all these cases, the judges have put in some kind of injunction that you can't fire, you can't cut the budget, you can't do this. Now, we just had the new numbers come out in terms of the civilian payroll, and across the first 100 days, and I think it was like 2.4 million is now 2.36 or 2.38, or something like that. So it's just a tiny minute kind of drop. Okay, at least it's going in the right direction compared to how it was going before. But I do worry about DOGE in terms of its
yeah,
ultimate impact,
yeah.
because you get a couple of these big ticket items where they found like 150 million fraud here or there or whatever. Even if we forget about the courts, even if we say, okay, that's been cut, that's good now, those are one-off things. Those are not repetitive. Once it's gone, it's gone. And then what? Even if you look at US aid, what was that? Like some tens of billions. Okay, that's a big chunk of money, but in the kind of grander scheme of things, in the terms of, say, the federal payroll and so on, it's just a drop in the bucket. So, what's the longer term impact? I don't think it will be that huge, especially with the courts kind of stymieing everything along the way. There's a limited amount of time. People keep saying 4 years, but it's really just 2 years because it's the midterms that count. Because what if Democrats take over in November of 2026 in the House? And then immediately you have impeachment, and then you're just completely preoccupied with all that kind of stuff. I think the most important thing that DOGE can do, or will end up doing, is changing the mindset. Every time these Doge people come out and do an interview, I, I I just get the sense that most people are impressed and most people agree. And so it's not a 50-50 issue. It's more like an 80-20 issue. When the Doge people start talking about the waste, the inefficiency, the this, the that, and so on and so forth. Um, I think if you can change the mindset, if most people kind of get on that train, and whoever the Democrat candidate is going to be in 28 is also sort of supportive generally of that, then you can slowly move. You know how they say, you can turn a big ship quickly. It's going to take time and so on. So I think that would be the best outcome realistically that we can hope for.
Well, I mean, what do you think Doge is really all about? Because um, there are a number of people that have been tracking their claims and watching their website very carefully. And there's a lot of suspicious activity going. In the middle of the night, they change the numbers and they're always going down, not up. I mean, is this more of a political campaign than really a campaign of reforming the government? Because, as you pointed out, I mean, these are just very thin layers when in the grand scheme of things here. I mean, it's a feel-good thing. I don't think Elon Musk was the right person to do it. I think that's one of the reasons why he's stepping back. But what is the real? I mean, you're making the claim that it's like an aircraft carrier once you turn it around, but it takes a very long time. I don't know if that ethos is going to set in because of the perception by many people that this was Elon Musk tinkering with agencies that he just didn't particularly like, that were bothersome to him and his business interests.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but I think it is a number of things. So I think it's about efficiency. It's about finding fraud. It's about reducing the number of employees, reducing the payroll. It's about one of the big things that has come out that will probably be have a longer lasting effect is to um, sharpen up the computer systems because they're all like using IT systems from however long ago, and none of these systems were compatible. So that, kind of renewing that or just modernizing that will have a longer term impact. Um, the PR, yeah, I think it is, but I think that's important because if you make people aware of all these problems, then you get more support in the next election and the one after that and so on. And then you can ultimately deal with the problem on a sort of 5, 10, 20-year timeline, which is probably what it's going to take.
Mhm.
And if you ask me what is the kind of ultimate goal of all this, or what should it be in terms of when, if you really want to have an impact on the deficit and how the government is run and freeing up money for the economy and so on, is just reducing the amount of people. I mean, I'm sure, we just mentioned 2.4 million. On in Twitter, they took out 90% and nothing changed.
Okay.
I'm sure you could take out at least half and nothing would change just by automating, making things more efficient, getting rid of a lot of kind of dead wood. But that's not going to happen. We see it every time they fire like 100 people. There's a big lawsuit and everyone gets dragged down again and so on. So look, I think there's a lot of things they're trying to do. I don't think it's just one. It might have started as one being sort of efficiency, but it's like across the board, many different things going on at the same time. And I guess people can take their pick as to what they think is more prominent or not or whatever. We'll see. But look, I'm generally very supportive of this effort. I'm not as sort of optimistic or confident as many of these others are. The Doge watch you mentioned earlier, I mean that's just a gimmick. There's no way the one that keeps going up. We saved so much money. Each day we're saving another billion or whatever. How do you measure that? That's just a gimmick.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you about something that really is quite interesting is the administration's war against the universities, because this has been a long time coming. I mean, Nixon wanted to do this, Reagan wanted to do this, and the universities are extremely powerful. They're very wealthy, and they've got their way over the years. That's how they got so rich. Essentially, the government underwriting student loans, and they got more and more. They could keep raising their tuition fees. So now the administration's gone after them. Now it's used a very peculiar argument, a very implausible argument, which is the anti-Semitic thing, which I think is implausible, but it is a way to go after them. I mean, it's a way to say, hey, well, you're in violation of the Civil Rights Act, and so therefore it's at least a basis for bringing a legal action against them, because otherwise it's hard to see how you can bring legal action against universities.
Yeah, and Hans, by approaching it through the lens of anti-Semitism, isn't that just what's the legal term? Fruit from the poison tree. I'm just appalled that they're using this approach of rooting out anti-Semitism to get rid of Mongolian dance studies, which I'm actually against. I don't think anyone should go in debt to learn something like that at university. I find it very problematic.
But that's not a way governments can go
Well,
after.
George, it has that's a very that's the chilling effect that has throughout of society is truly profound. Okay, particularly when it's involved the foreign policy interests of a foreign country and not the United States. So just as that kind of a proviso, I agree with George. This is a segue into approaching the. I mean, I left academia in disgust and I'm glad that it's being challenged, but not by this means. Go ahead.
I also left academia in disgust, not entirely. I still have a little foot in it, but the universities in general, not just American ones, are completely broken. You see that across the board. You
Absolutely.
see a huge ballooning of the administration. Just, you don't need administrators, but now you've
Right.
got far more than you've got teachers, in many cases, far more than you have students. Um, as George said, they're very powerful, they're very entrenched, they have a lot of money, and they do indoctrinate. So that part is absolutely true. Now, again, this sort of if I, say Harvard, I would go after Harvard for the China stuff.
Yeah,
That's
I
the big
agree.
one. What they've done with China is horrendous. The amount of collaboration they have with China completely unchecked um, is just that's where you go. You go national security. You go, you have a lot of angles there to go after these guys. And you see it in other places as well. But look, I totally welcome the idea of going after the universities. I think this is
I could.
extremely important. They're far too powerful. And also they don't have to conform to any market structure or anything like that. Again, to take the example of Harvard, but otherwise other ones do this as well. They take in far less students than they could because they want to keep it exclusive.
That's right.
Well, that stops many people from having an opportunity to be in Harvard. So, is that fair? But they're only able to do it because they're sitting on a pot of money. Um, you go across, there's just you could talk about this all day. As you said, the Mongolian dance, I mean, that kind of stuff just runs throughout the entire kind of university ecosystem that you have a gazillion courses that are just
Yeah,
complete
my
trash.
litmus test is if it ends with studies, delete it. Okay.
Yeah,
There's
there
also
are.
the other aspect. I mean, leading on from the China, which is something like 55, 60% of graduate students at Harvard are foreign. And this is done deliberately. I mean, they do it because foreign students come with money. So it's a way they bring in even more and more money. Now, these are the most prestigious universities in the country, and more than half of the student allotments are handed over to foreigners. Now, there is a governmental interest in ensuring that Americans, native-born Americans, get into these very privileged entities, which namely these Ivy League universities. So is that something you could go after? That you've got to minimize the number of foreign students you have.
Absolutely, you could.
Absolutely.
I'm always against quotas, but you could certainly do things with that. In terms of the coming back to these courses, I mean, I agree with Peter. Anything if it ends in studies is no good. I mean, if you go back to way back 100 years back or so, there were these core courses that you could do. And that's how it ought to be. You need to learn advanced math, then you got the math. Or you do biology, you got the biology. You got law, you got law, whatever it is. The idea that you have within these, you then go deeper and deeper and come up with just this. Sometimes it can work. Like within physics, you can have subcategories which are very helpful and useful and so on. But especially in the social sciences, I mean, in social sciences, you could pretty much get rid of, everything. Um, and that problem it will resolve itself in the way that a lot of these people are not employable, especially kind of going forward with more AI and all that kind of stuff. Um, it will resolve itself with costs because a lot of people just can't afford to take these courses. So I think we will see a natural shift back to foundational courses to learning proper stuff. But it is, I mean, the problem, if I was going to look at it from a kind of a 30,000 foot view, is that the whole thing has become an industry. And education should never have been an industry to begin with. It's all like a business model, as you were saying. Half of the people are foreigners because they bring in more money. We got more courses because we can make more money. And everyone is supposed to have a degree and so on and so forth. And they're just looking at it. At some point, these things were popping up like mushrooms. They're looking at it as a business model, and it should just never be seen that way. But of course, it's encouraged because you can build up your endowment, you get nonprofit status, you get all these lovely kind of things. And in the meantime, the ones who leech off of that are the ones on the inside, these administrators, all these kinds of people who just pay themselves. They're sort of NGOs in a kind of way where you just have an easy life and take a lot of money. So I think there needs to be huge change in the universities. I'm happy that they're trying to do something. I would come at it from many, many different angles, all at the same time. I wouldn't expect any immediate results. This is going to, again, this is one of these longer, very long-term projects. But, of the ones we mentioned, the tax status is important. I think Trump has just revoked Harvard's
Yes,
tax-free
he
status.
announced it today.
We're gonna have a big case on that. The DEI is very important. I mean, the Supreme Court got rid of affirmative action some years ago, but then the universities kind of found another way of going around that. I would also go the national security route. I think that is such an important path because there is a lot of very crucial and important information being generated within universities. There's a lot of collaboration with other universities, which is there's no oversight. I mean, it's incredible what you have to go through as a company if you want to sell something to a supposedly hostile regime. There's a gazillion things you do. But if you're a university, you could do whatever you want. I mean, I always think of that one example of the University of North Carolina. They sent something called humanized mice. Those are highly advanced Western biotechnology mice that basically mimic human lungs. So in terms of their lungs, they're just like humans. So you can practice on the mouse and you don't kill any humans in the process while practicing on the mouse, but it's exactly the same. Biologically, those two are equals. This is highly advanced stuff. What did they do, North Carolina? They sent the mice to Wuhan. If they hadn't sent the mice to, and there was no one had to do any export control or nothing. They just send them. Okay, fine. Without the mice, there wouldn't have been a COVID. I mean, that's just one example, but this goes on in the aerospace industry and all across the board, physics and so on. And we have absolutely no oversight. We have no idea what's going on. So that's an angle that I don't think they've looked at all or deeply or whatever. So I would also go after that. I mean, it's one of these broad spectrum things. There's probably 100 different things you should do, and you should do them all at the same time.
Hans, I want to, before we finish, I'd like to address two things. One very broad, and you are the supreme expert on Russiagate. I want to ask you if there's anything you want to mention about that before we finish. But before that, Trump has passed his 100 days. Grade him on his ability, his efforts to reform the government.
I'd probably give him a B plus at this point. It would have been an A if it had been the first term. Unfortunately, the problems, he wasn't allowed to do anything in the first time around because Russiagate, we really mentioned that. And unfortunately, the problems have just gotten so much worse and so much more entrenched. I mean, just Ukraine, we haven't even talked about Ukraine at all. That problem was resolvable back in 2017. It's much, much more difficult to kind of disentangle now. So he's been dealt a very kind of bad hand of cards, no doubt. And then with the courts obstructing and all this kind of stuff. But within all that, I think he's still done fairly well, pretty well, So I'd say B plus.
It's quite an audacious agenda because going after the universities, I didn't think that they would do it. I mean, and that showed an understanding of what was important, because the universities are absolutely crucial. If you don't address that problem, then it doesn't matter. You could have another Trump in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, and he's going to get into the same problem as before, because the universities essentially create the infrastructure of society through their think tanks, through their NGOs, through all the various civil society programs. They're all attached to these elite universities. And so it doesn't matter who comes in, who really wields power, because what matters are the universities. And so the fact that Trump has done this, I guess he took his lesson from Viktor Orban, or probably Orban told him, this is what you need to do. You need to go after universities. That surprised me. That surprised that he was as imaginative enough as to do just that. And the law firms. I mean, the law firms in America are immensely powerful, and to go after the law firms again. So you have to just credit Trump for the audacity of his agenda.
I had no idea that some of the law firms in Washington, D.C. had skiffs in them. I had no idea. It boggles the mind that you have some of the most important intelligence, and it's lawyers that none of us elected. We don't even know who they are, having access to that kind of information, which is very valuable, by the way.
Yeah, and now they're suing to try and keep those privileges, which is completely ridiculous. I mean, these are little gifts, actually pretty big gifts that DC gives to other people in DC, and they leverage that to make a lot of money. They don't have a right to that. They have as much as a right to that as you or me. Um, so revoke it. And now they're suing. So again, well, I mean, I think one of the law firms has actually gotten a little victory already in court, and it's such a drag each time when it goes through. But yeah, I agree with George. It's a very audacious agenda. And I think he's been freed up by especially the intervening 4 years. So it's the experience of the first 4 years, but it's also the intervening 4 years when they just came after him in every possible way, nonstop, where he just, on the one hand, he just doesn't care about, being liked or all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, it's also just a realization of, now or never. In a way, they created this. I keep saying if they had just let him be president again, if they hadn't done all the shenanigans in 2020 and so on, they would have just had a pretty good presidency, and then would have kind of petered out, and now we would have, Kamala or whatever, and everything would be back to normal. Normal in the old
Be
way.
careful what you wish for. Jeez, be careful what you wish for. Hans, Trump has been in office for over 100 days or so. We were promised the release of documents related to Russiagate. Where do we stand on that?
Well, they did release the so-called binder. Pretty underwhelming. It just ties up some loose ends, but what's missing is anything to do with the CIA. Now, I don't want to digress too far here or whatever, but the CIA had a pretty deep involvement in Russiagate, but all the focus has always been on the FBI. Perhaps the most important part the CIA played in Russiagate is that they found out very, very early on, and very few people know this, that the entire thing that was being investigated, in fact, even before the FBI started investigating it, they found out that it was a Hillary Clinton campaign smear, plot, whatever you want to call it, scheme. The CIA found out through intercepted communications involving Hillary's staff. So the CIA knew the whole, and they told Obama. So they knew it was a hoax. And Obama and the CIA thought, oh, well, instead of shutting down the hoax, or instead of telling Hillary, hey, we know, don't do this or whatever, they thought, let's co-opt the hoax. Let's play along. Let's weaponize the hoax. I think that's the biggest thing out of all of Russiagate, that the most important thing that you could know about all of Russiagate, that the government in the form of Obama and the CIA, and then they told the FBI as well. So they all knew it was a hoax, and yet they still went ahead and turned it into a 4 year circus against Trump. That is just completely horrific when you think about it on any possible level. Now, we know that happened because of a tiny little snippet that John Ratcliffe released some years ago when he was Director of National Intelligence, just like one or two sentences. That's all we have, plus Ratcliffe's commentary about the fact that had happened. The media, of course, just never really reported that. But everything else surrounding that, the briefing of Obama, what Obama told the FBI to do in response, what the CIA did in response, all these documents, in fact, no CIA documents whatsoever have been released. So that entire part of it, really remains under lock and key. And that's just a huge scandal. But of course, we know why it remains under lock and key, because it directly implicates the highest levels of government, including Obama, in the whole scheme.
One thing in light of this sudden appointment of Marco Rubio as interim national security advisor, and you really pointed out at the time of the Signalgate that it's time to push aside Mike Waltz and replace him with Michael Flynn because a great injustice was done against Michael Flynn, and Trump himself felt that he had committed a grave injustice against Michael Flynn. Do you think that there's any chance at all that Michael Flynn will be restored to his rightful position?
You can always hope. It would be so fantastic on so
It
many
would be.
levels. It would be true justice. They got rid of the guy after a couple of weeks on a hoax, on a lie. By the way, in that Russiagate binder, we did have some more information on making up that lie against just completely made up the fact that Flynn is supposed to have talked to the Russian ambassador about sanctions, which he never ever did. And they knew he didn't, but they still went ahead with that story. They told Mike Pence, they told the White House lawyer, they told the same lie over and over. And those idiots, instead of not trusting what they were told by the DOJ, which by the way was still Obama's DOJ at the time, they were like, "Oh my goodness, Michael Flynn lied," and then they, fired him. Absolutely horrendous, horrific. Yeah, I mean, it would be one of the greatest sort of things that could ever happen if he got his job back, just in terms of justice, in terms of fairness, in terms of all the good things, all the right things. And I don't think it's going to happen.
Why don't you think it'll happen?
I think if it were up to just Trump himself, his kind of gut instinct, the way he does things, he'll do it, he'd do it, but there will be a lot of voices that will say, "Oh, you don't want Flynn because it's just gonna open up all those wounds, and you're gonna have the media screaming again." For instance, one of the unfortunate things, we know why, and we know they threatened his son and so on, but he did plead guilty. It was coerced, but he did do that. So they're just gonna open that box again and say, "Oh my goodness, this is guy who pled
Well, and
guilty, and then he got a."
also over the years after his legal debacle came to an end, I saw him on a number of podcasts. There's a lot of things he said that people will go after and question him. I mean, he has some interesting and then some kind of crazy ideas at the same time. But it would be historical justice. I think what would work against that is that I hope at least that Trump is aware that his foreign policy people, and George and I talked about this last week, he needs to send an order out. Everybody keep your mouth shut. Everyone. Because he needs to clear the air on so many foreign policy issues right now. I'm glad Mike Waltz is gone. I'm a completely incompetent person for that position. Okay. I mean, absolutely. Um, but he needs maybe bringing Marco Rubio on board, which George and I do not like at all. But maybe we'll kind of get some kind of uniformity in message. Even if it's a bad message, I'd like to know what the administration thinks.
I don't think he's going to be as national security advisor on a long-term basis.
Oh
So
yeah, I
do
don't.
you have a sense, Hans, who might be slotted for that position?
Witkoff?
Yeah, Witkoff.
They keep saying Wyckoff, we're gonna have the same problems again because people are gonna say, "Oh, he has no experience. He's a real estate developer or whatever." It's
I
just,
think that's the biggest plus. Because
I agree with you.
all these other seasoned people, they're the ones that have gotten us into all of these messes. George and I've talked at great length about Witkoff. I find him a very interesting character. He's got more pluses in my mind than negatives at this
Yeah,
point.
that's right.
I don't know. I have no insight whatsoever. I have no insider information. I have no idea whom they're going to select. I agree that it's not going to. I mean, Marco Rubio is not going to have this for very long. Eventually, they'll pick someone and they'll put him in that position. Um, I'll just go with Mike Flynn just because I want that to happen so much.
All right. Well, Hans, thank you so much once again for giving us your time and so many interesting, fascinating insights and observations. So thank you, and look forward to having you back again soon. So bye bye,
Would love
Hans.
to.